other little g gods that other nations worship. And so some translations in English say gods, that Aaron makes gods for the people to follow, and some say that it makes a god, a little g god, for the people to follow. But later in the text in Exodus 32, Aaron says that tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord, to Yahweh. So Aaron is trying really hard to still keep within the covenant. He's trying so hard. It says the people approach Aaron, and the word in Hebrew that's used for the verb of what the people are doing to Aaron is actually a verb that indicates conflict or potential violence. So the people are not just talking to Aaron like, hey man, like we're kind of bummed out here. Could you just make us a god? They're like surrounding Aaron, like ready to throw down with Aaron if he doesn't create for them something that they can believe in. And so Aaron says, tomorrow will be a festival to Yahweh. And so the people accept this, that, okay, so you're going to make us this golden bull, and that will still be representative of Yahweh. When I read Exodus 32 growing up or hearing the story of the golden calf, I had always thought that the story meant that the people were getting rid of Yahweh, getting rid of the Lord, their God, and that they were creating new random gods. They were just going to make up a god. They were like, not even creating gods of other nations. They were just like, let's just make up a god, and that'll be the God we follow. That's actually not what's happening in the text, although I think sometimes it gets read that way because they tell Aaron, make us gods or God, depending on how you translate it, for us to follow. But really, they're creating an image which in their mind they can say, here's this thing that can represent the Lord for us, because we have no idea where Moses went, and Moses was a prophet, and so Moses, while he was with them, represents Yahweh, right? That the role of a prophet is to speak between the people and God, and so for this whole experience of being brought out of Egypt and through the wilderness and into the desert, that Moses was the representative of God. But now that Moses is up on this mountain and they have no idea what happened to him, the other texts say that Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, which isn't literally 40 days and 40 nights, but that gets used in the Bible to mean a very long time, right? A very, very long extended period of time. So they don't know. So there's no longer this man Moses who was a speaker for God, and so they say we need something physical that we can see that reminds us that we can follow something, that we can put our faith into something, and that we can burn our offerings and put them in front of this bull. And that makes us feel comfortable because it's a physical representation of something that we feel that we can give something to. And that, for our human minds, makes us feel like there is something tangible about a god or this unseen force, whatever it is. But we can see this bull. So when we read this text, it's easy to think, what is wrong with these Israelites? Like it's easy as a modern later person, right, to look at this text, and also that we know we have the whole story, to look at these people and say, these people are pretty dumb. Like Moses just up on the mountain. When you read the words, it says Moses is gone a long time. That kind of to us sounds like, well, Moses was maybe gone for 4 hours or something, and the people just got impatient, and then they just said, heck with God, like let's just make our own. That's not really what's happening here, right? I think we can have a little bit of empathy for the Israelites instead of saying, oh, look at these forgetful, stupid people making this statue for them to follow and to give offerings to. I think if someone was gone for 40 days and 40 nights, or in another translated way, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, up on a mountain that you couldn't see, that you'd start to feel really anxious. That this man who you had never met came and busted into your life in Egypt, and that even though that was oppression, you at least could know what to expect day to day, right? That even in oppression, you at least experienced regularity. You knew what to expect each day, even if it was not good. Even if it was not flourishing, you knew there was an expectation. And so this man who you had never met says that there is this God that you have never seen and busts you out of Egypt and then splits the Red Sea and takes you across it straight into the desert. And you're supposed to trust this guy who now has gone up on a mountain. So I think you could kind of see how the Israelites need something maybe to put their hope in. And maybe we've experienced that, needing something to put our hope in. So it's not always out of malice in which we create idols. I think there are many sermons that have been preached on Exodus 32 that say that we're creating malicious idols. And certainly there are ways in which our society creates evil idols out of things that do harm. We idolize certain things that create social supremacy, and those are malicious. But there are also times in which we create idols because we need to regulate ourselves. The people here are trying to regulate themselves and still try hard to have some relationship with God. But they forget, I think if we read Exodus 32 in reflection of all the scripture, they forget that earlier in the story of God, that God had already created an image on earth that was meant to be a reflection of the Lord to each of us in our physical and our tangible need to be reminded of God's grace, of God's compassion, of God's love, of God leading us. Does anyone know what that image is that God already made in Genesis? Yeah. Well, the rainbow is a physical symbol that God uses to remind people of mercy. But God created humans, not just in the image of God, but actually, if you translate it to English, that God created humans as the image of God. Imago Dei. The reason why that small difference actually matters is that if you read that God created humans in the image of God, that just kind of reads like, oh, like the reflection of who I am must be how God looks. But that's not so. That's not what the Hebrew reads. The way that the Hebrew reads it is that humans have been made as the image of God, that we are image bearers here on earth. And that's not to say that we're meant to be worshiped. We are not, because that is unhealthy, because that is us trying to take the role of God. But it is to say that God has created each of us as the image of God, to bear the image, to remind each of us of God, of God's covenant, of God's laws, of God's love. To bear the image of God is to remind us daily as we encounter other people in the world what God calls us to in loving our neighbor. So instead of creating idols like the golden calf to remind us, or not to remind us, but to lead us, right? We do that. We definitely do that. I do that, right? We create idols that we call God. We might create idols out of ideas that we think if we just latch onto that hard enough, it will lead us somewhere. But it might not actually be God. We create idols, perhaps, out of political parties that we think can save this country, even though it's made up of imperfect people. They might be imperfect people that more or less align with you, but we create idols hoping and putting all of our hope in that one group. We make idols out of money, saying if I just earn enough money, I'll be secure and it'll lead me somewhere good. And we'll do anything to have enough of it or more of it or all of it. Not to downplay its importance, and of course living our lives and being able to afford things like housing and food, but when we want more and more and more because we idolize what we think it can do for us, that is what the people are doing. Is that they're incredibly anxious, and that is a reasonable feeling, but they are creating an idol, which they believe will lead them. So I think it's important to read Exodus 32 in reflection of Genesis, in which Genesis reminds us that God created image bearers. And so even in those moments when we cannot feel God's presence, is it possible that when we encounter the image of another, that they call us into love? Is it possible that instead of putting down all of our riches or donating all of our money into one pot that we think will make us richer, is it possible that instead of these idols in which we offer burnt offerings all in one, that when we encounter the image of another who asks us for our hand, that asks us for our help, that asks us for some food, that is part of being reminded of God? We don't need to go to all of these other idols to remember that there is a God that calls us to serve. There's not an idol that can remind us what it feels like to intimately experience joy with other people. And so is it possible that Exodus 32 is trying to not just shame us for all of the bad things that we put our attention in? If you read Exodus 32 completely alone, that's all it's doing. That's all Exodus 32 is really good for if you're not reading it in reflection of Genesis and of the Gospels. All it really does is to say you're forgetful and a terrible person and you don't love God enough. But if you read Exodus with Genesis and with the Gospels, what it's saying is not only are there advocates on your behalf who will intercede, not only does God actually remember also even in anger, but that you are an image bearer and your neighbor is an image bearer, and then in the Gospels that the greatest commandment is to love God and to love neighbor, who is an image bearer of God. So God's already created not an idol, but a reminder, a physical representation manifest for us that we don't need to go out and seek and create for ourselves. Even when you look in the mirror, this is a reminder of love, of compassion, of transformation. So Exodus 32 is an age-old story that sometimes we feel like, all right, I've heard that one enough. It's a story that might make us feel like, oh, that's not the God I really want to follow. Like, oh, if that's what God wanted to do to the people, then I guess he's right. I get to get out of here. But hopefully, as you wrestle with the text, and as you continue in your faith journey, your faith walk, wherever that's taking you, that you would read Exodus 32 in the reflection of all texts as a reminder that there is good news, even in Exodus 32. So I'm encouraging you this morning to not just think about what Exodus 32 is telling you not to do, but what it is trying to remind you all this morning of what is possible, what you could do, what is there already. Right? I think it's something we often don't take the time to do. It's to slow down and to really look at the image of another and think of how that might change how you relate to your Lord, to the God that brought people out of Egypt. So I'll encourage you this week, just continue to wrestle with that. What does that mean for you? How do you encounter that in your daily life? Are there people that it's easier to see the image of God in than others? Are there some people that we think, oh, it's not really the image of God, but all these other people, that's the image of God? How can it change you? Is it changing you? I think all these questions, I just invite you to continue to ponder as we journey together into the week. Amen.